Liebe Leserinnen und Leser der ZEIT, herzlich willkommen zu einem neuen Autorengespräch rund um unser aktuelles Buch des Monats in der ZEIT-Literaturcommunity. Mein Name ist Wenke Czanakakis und mein Team und ich laden Sie monatlich zu diesen digitalen Lagerfeuern für Buchbegeisterte ein. Doch so viele wie heute für John Irving waren wir noch nie. Und auch wenn Sie uns jetzt alleine zuschauen, seien Sie versichert, Sie sind in bester Gesellschaft von vielen tausend Buchbegeisterten. Und viele von Ihnen haben schon losgelegt, was wir zu einer kleinen Tradition hier machen bei unseren Sessions hier unter Freunden der ZEIT ist, dass wir Sie immer bitten, uns zu sagen, von wo Sie überall zugeschaltet sind. Heute haben sich über 6.000 Menschen angemeldet für dieses Autorengespräch mit John Irving und ich habe gesehen, Sie sind aus Bonn, aus Pöhl, im Vogtland, aus dem Erzgebirge, aus Kiel, Berlin, Bad Segeberg, Münster, Wien, Rostock und sogar von einer kleinen Farm aus North Carolina heute mit dabei. Und weil so viele dabei sein wollten, dass es sogar unsere Zoom-Lizenz gesprengt hat, dürfen wir heute auch auf ZEIT Online streamen. Herzlich willkommen auch an alle, die bei ZEIT Online nur zufällig vorbei surfen. Hier sind Sie genau richtig, wenn Sie ein neues Buch kennenlernen wollen und seinen großartigen Erzähler, der uns Erwachsenen hilft, ein bisschen das Fenster zu einer inneren Welt zu öffnen, jenseits der draußen so sehr beschleunigten Welt. Und damit möchte ich mich schon fast von Ihnen verabschieden und Ihnen nur noch die Moderatorin des Abends vorstellen. Denn durch das Gespräch mit John Irving und später auch mit Benedict Wells führen wird uns Fiona Weber-Steinhaus. Sie kennen Fiona vielleicht schon aus ihren Texten auf ZEIT Online, wo sie neben vielen Gesellschaftsreportagen für das ZEIT-Magazin auch große Interviews führt. Etwa mit dem Lieblingskoch vieler Deutscher Jotam Ottolenghi oder mit Natascha Kampusch vor kurzem. Und mit Fiona kann man auch ganz wunderbar darüber fachsimpeln, inwiefern schottischer Whisky beim Auskurieren kleiner Erkältungen hilft. Das nur am Rande, denn Fiona hat eine schottische Mutter und Großmutter und hat auch selbst in Glasgow und Dublin studiert, ist sozusagen Native English Speaker und dadurch ein sprachlicher Gewinn für das nun jetzt gleich auf Englisch stattfindende Autorengespräch mit John Irving. Bitte begrüßen Sie jetzt mit einem ganz herzlichen digitalen Applaus Fiona Weber-Steinhaus hier bei uns.
Hallo Wenke. Schön,
Hallo.
schön, dich zu sehen.
Fiona, schön, dass du dabei bist. Wir freuen uns sehr, dass du uns durch den Abend führst und du musstest schon eine gewisse Vorarbeit leisten, denn du hast ein gewisses Konvolut an Fragen der Leser schon vorab bekommen. Wie viele Leserfragen haben dich denn an John Irving erreicht?
Genau, ich habe 300 Leserinnen und Leserfragen bekommen und werde deswegen dieses Gespräch nicht nur moderieren, sondern durchaus als Medium der Leserinnen und Leser fungieren. Und ich werde ab und zu zur Seite gucken, weil da sind nämlich ihre Fragen, auf die ich dann auch zurückgreifen werde.
Wunderbar, Fiona. Dann verabschiede ich mich jetzt und wünsche Ihnen und uns allen ein packendes Gespräch. Danke, dass du uns durchführst.
Now I'll switch to English. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to welcome one of the guests that many of you have requested to listen to. He's one of the most revered writers of our time. He's won an array of literary awards, and he's got an Oscar in his house, and he's written 15 books. All of them are a delight to read, and all of them are really thick so that you can probably harm someone if you smack someone over the head with it. Welcome and good afternoon to you, John Irving. John, would you join us, please, from Toronto?
Grüß Gott, Fiona.
Grüß Gott nach Toronto. We will perhaps talk in German as well later, but we'll start in English.
Das ist für mich auf Englisch.
Okay, good. John, in your new novel, The Last Chairlift, we get to know Adam Brewster, and a young man aspiring to be a writer and looking also for his father. What was the starting point for this novel that you started many years ago?
Like all my novels, the starting point was the ending. The starting point was what was going to happen to Adam's loved ones, because he has a rather extended family of loved ones. His mother, her girlfriend, her husband, who transitions to female, and then there's Adam's cousin and her girlfriend. It's a large family that Adam has, and everyone in it but him is queer. He is much loved and looked after by this family. And in the same trajectory, or a similar trajectory to A Prayer for Owen Meany, Adam is a first-person narrator. Mm-hmm. He's telling you the story of what happens to the people he loves.
He is the only straight character of the main characters in this novel, as you mentioned. Why did you make this choice?
I think that in those many families where there is a gay child, a lesbian child, a trans child, that the queer member of the family is the lone one, and the other straight members of that family try to accommodate and protect, to take care of the queer member of the family. I wanted to reverse that picture so that in Adam's family, he's not only the only straight guy, he's the slowest to learn. He's the one that all the queer people are looking after. He's the one that needs to be looked after, in their opinion. I wanted to switch the table, so to speak, or turn the coin, and make the straight guy the one who is queer in the sense of unusual in his family.
Was that decision a political stance that you wanted to take?
Well, I think it's evident that in those novels of mine, which I would call political, or which I would describe as having social themes. What I mean by a social theme is that I take one side or another of an issue, of a social issue. Well, by my count, not more than half, or barely more than half, maybe 7 or 8 of my 15 novels are what I would call political. But in those novels, I am usually positioning myself as an ally to women's rights, because women's rights are being overlooked, as in Gottes Werk und Teufels Beitrag, as in the Abtreibung subject, or I am identifying or presenting myself as an ally to the LGBTQ community. I am an ally to those queer characters in my novels, and have been since Garpunkt Vier de Weltsaal.
And that also has a personal aspect to it. I believe you're. I'm thinking of your mother and your siblings when you grew up. Perhaps you can give us an input how you grew up.
Well, even in the 1970s, when I was still writing Garp und wie die Welt sah. I was at the time a young, quite unknown writer. Garp was my fourth novel. Mm-hmm. I had two young children. I had a younger brother and sister, boy-girl twins, who were gay and lesbian. And one night when I was back in New Hampshire visiting my family, I heard my mother say in another room, she wasn't saying it to me, I think she was speaking to someone on television. She always did that. And I heard her say, if men in power can treat women as if we are sexual minorities, how much worse will those men treat gay and men and lesbian women? This was in the mid-1970s. In those years, both before and after the Roe versus Wade court decision that gave women the right to choose an abortion, my mother was a nurse's aide in a county family counseling service. This mostly entailed her counseling young women, young unmarried women who were pregnant, often young underage girls who were under the legal age to be having sex.
Garp, The World According to Garp was published in 1978 and had the, I think, most well-known trans character Roberta in it. And it feels somehow kind of weird rereading your work, like having grown up with it, or reviewing your films, because the topics that you deal with, also the topic of sexual politics, seems so topical. It seems under fire at the moment, especially in the US and in many countries all around.
Well, I don't take credit for being prophetic. I'm always writing historical novels. I always look back at the past. Wie sagt man, die Vergangenheit. I'm always looking back because I understand the past better than I can predict the future. I would say that my birth country, the United States, has politically, in the area of sexual politics, gone backwards. It's not so much that I'm a prophet of what is going to happen. It's more the case that the sexual politics in my birth country, the United States, is moving backward. Backward in the area of women's rights, of abortion rights, which are now in upheaval in the United States, and actively backward in the area of LGBTQ rights. Even when I was writing Garp und wie die Welt sah, even when I was writing it, I imagined that this subject of sexual intolerance would be dated or passé before I finished the book. I was wrong. I was totally wrong, right?
Yeah, you were wrong. The prophetic aspect didn't work out at that point.
No.
In the book, there's one aspect that transcends also many of your novels, but Adam is driven also by the fear for his loved ones. He's worried about his stepfather, who transitions later, and he's worried about the well-being of his cousins as well. Why is this fear for the loved ones? How did that come about? That is the driving force in this book.
Well, I think the fear of the loss of loved ones is a recurrent theme or subject in many of my novels, including those novels that aren't especially political. Furthermore, I mentioned the first-person narrative voice earlier. It's my opinion that when a character is loved, and I hope as a writer, that my readers will love and be afraid for what will happen or might happen to that character too. When that's what the story is about, the pain of losing someone you love, a family member, a best friend, whoever, well, I think the reader feels that pain or empathy more if the story is in the voice of a character who will suffer that loss more than the reader. I don't like the first-person voice. It makes a long story longer. You always have to explain how the first-person narrator knows what he or she knows. But in the case of Owen Meany, in the case of Der letzte Sessellift, well, the point of those novels is the pain of losing someone who you're afraid for most of the story. Well, that's why there's a first-person narrative for Owen Meany and why there's a first-person narrative for Der letzte Sessellift.
And this fear of, or you write in The Last Chairlift that loving a child means living with the fear of losing a child. And one reader asked how this topic that reoccurs in so many books, whether it helps you personally to write. Does writing help against the fear of losing your loved ones?
No, not at all. Writing as therapy, in my opinion, is bad therapy or no therapy, and it's also generally bad writing. I would say that I don't write about this therapeutically. I'm obsessed with this subject and have been. Maybe it goes back to my own case of being a very young and unprepared father the first time I had a child. I was a very young
20s, weren't you?
I was a very young father. I was still in university. I was still a student when my first son was born, and I had never experienced before the kind of unconditional love for someone who instantly, from the moment this child was born, made me afraid for how I was ever going to protect him. So it may have been a consequence of timing and age and sheer unpreparedness of being such a young father. Maybe it came from there. I was already writing when my first child was born, but the subject of that fear of losing a loved one began internally at that moment in time.
Were you aware of that, or did you kind of like find that out while looking back at your novels, that this was kind of like a driving force in so many of the books?
I was aware of loving that tension as a reader when you love a character in a story, but you also are concerned for what's going to happen to that character you love. I felt that way in Dickens's novels. I felt that way in Melville's Moby Dick. You can't read Moby Dick and not know that the voyage of that ship is doomed. You can't read that novel and not know that the Pequod is headed for trouble. A madman is the captain.
Yeah.
Crazy idea. And of course, they're going to get in trouble. So every time you meet another member of the crew on board, you are afraid for them. You know what's going to happen. Well, I was very familiar with that fear of what's going to happen as a motivating force for me that made me want to be a writer. That made me want to be a writer. I was only 15 when I read Dickens's Great Expectations, the novel that made me want to be a writer, but only if I could be a writer like Dickens, namely to affect a reader emotionally more than I intended to persuade a reader intellectually. And then there was Moby Dick, which I read 2 years later. I was only 17. And I thought, my God, this guy knew what the ending was when he was writing the beginning. Dickens wasn't an ending guy. Dickens kind of winged it. He found his endings when he got there. I love Dickens, but not for his endings. Melville was the guy who showed me, oh my God, he was thinking about Queequeg's coffin when he introduces Queequeg in chapter 3. It was all set up.
So in this book, did you begin with the last sentence or the last chapters? In the last book?
You know, too much has been made of the last sentence. I almost regret that I revealed that I write last sentences first. I said sentences, not the last sentence, meaning that one of the reasons I choose among the notes I take about novels before I begin them, one of the reasons that makes me choose this novel instead of the other ones to write next is that I choose the one where I know the most about the ending. I have 3 or 4 last sentences that might work equally well. So far, they haven't changed. But I keep saying, if I'm writing a novel and I ever think of a better last sentence, I won't hesitate to use it. It's not a religion. It's just that's the way it is. Usually, I've written most of the last chapter, almost all of the last chapter, long before I get there. Because as I move ahead in a story, I'm on 3 chapters, 5 chapters, 6 chapters. I go ahead and work the ending backward in a reverse direction. In the case of this novel, The Last Chairlift, I'd written most of the last 2 or 3 chapters before I got there. So I really had the ending, the whole ending, because there's a sizable number of major, minor characters whose endings I had to know exactly before I had confidence to begin. Dickens was the kind of genius who didn't need to know where he was going. I think Melville and I aren't geniuses. We need to know where we're going before we start.
So in this novel, there are many aspects that your fans will recognize. There's the town of Exeter, the quest for an absent father, an elusive, evasive mother. But as a few readers in the audience have noticed, there are no bears. And it seems to interest a lot of people. Why are there no bears in The Last Chairlift?
Well, I think the composition of a family that's missing something, of a family with a secret, is a larger aspect of my themes as a writer than bears. Bears aren't thematic. Bears are incidental. I haven't included bears in a long time, but once again, the detail of the bear seems to be something that many readers have focused on. The family component, a missing somebody, a story in the past that has not fully been revealed, so that as the story moves ahead and you are finding out what will happen, you are also learning about a story in the past. Now, that's a familiar and repeated theme. Bears are just local to time and place. Sometimes there's a good use for one, but lately I haven't thought of what that use might be. And now that once again I'm living full-time in a city, I do see bears every summer on the island where we go in Lake Huron in Ontario. Lots of bears there, but I don't necessarily see a bear in my future novels, the ones yet to be written.
That I'll quickly put in a small question, because so that means The Last Chairlift is not your last novel?
Absolutely not. What I can say, I think with some certainty, is that I believe it's my last long novel. Because I've been trying to write the longer novels or the more difficult looking novels first. As I get older, I think that's a hard one, better write it now because it won't be easier 5 years from now. And so I've been trying to take the more complicated or longer novels first. A long novel is not necessarily the most difficult. I spent only 6 years writing this novel, which is my longest novel. But when I say only 6 years, that's about average. Many shorter novels have taken me longer to write because there was in those novels something I had to learn that was completely outside my life's experience. The medicine, the historical medicine, for example, in Gottes Werk und Teufels Beitrag. I had to spend 2, almost 3 years learning about that before I could begin the novel. It's not as long as The Last Chairlift, but it took longer to write. You see what I mean?
So because the research aspect was so much bigger and you delved into...
The research aspect can make a shorter novel harder.
And with The Last Chairlift, I believe that the world of skiing is quite near to you and your family. How much research did you have to do, or how much did you actually just know from asking yourself and your family?
In the case of this novel, there was almost no research. I've grown up around skiing. I grew up skiing. My children are all better skiers than I am, much better. But for different reasons than Adam's reason, I see most of my family as being far better skiers than I am, but not for Adam's reasons. I never disliked skiing. It was simply because from the age of 15 until my mid-30s, I was wrestling, and wrestling was a winter sport. And therefore, because I was wrestling and later coaching wrestling, I had learned to ski pretty well as a child, but I stepped away from skiing at the age of 14 or 15, and I didn't go back to it until I was in my late 30s or 40s. So there was a whole period of time when the sport in my life was wrestling, not skiing, while everyone in my family went on skiing.
Two of your grandchildren are part of the US ski team, I believe. So they're not just good skiers, but professional athletes. We'll come to the wrestling part later. We'll quickly delve into the crafts, and I've condensed some of our readers' questions into like a quick either-or questionnaire. And we'll start with the question, Do you prefer writing with a pen or with a pencil?
That's a very good question, actually, because I used to write with a pencil. And then when I wrote Bis ich dich finde, Until I Find You, another long novel, I changed that novel. I changed the voice of that novel. And I gave myself tendinitis, tennis elbow, by erasing so much of it. And after that, I used a pen. So since Bis ich dich finde, I have only written with a pen, no more pencils.
Okay, as a medical hint as well.
It was a medical reason for it.
Yeah. Do you prefer writing in silence, or do you turn on music or the radio?
I'm not fussy about noise or background conversation. I had children when I was very young. I missed the sound of their voices or their interruptions. So I'm good at not being bothered by background sounds, but I never play music. I prefer to just think about the writing. I don't find music and writing go together. I have to say what I write out loud. I have to hear it out loud. So I don't like listening to a song in the background. No music.
What's the greatest part of writing? Writing, editing, or having written?
I think I enjoy all aspects of it. I beginning with the choice of which novel to write next, which I take very seriously. When I'm writing a novel, I do not think ahead. I do not allow myself to imagine what the novel after the one I'm writing will be. I finish that novel. I finish my editor's notes on that novel before I look at the 3 or 4 novels or 5 novels waiting to be written and choose one. So I love that moment when I make that choice and I just begin. I'm just beginning. But I also love it when I get to the ending, which has been, as I've said, previously written, or at least the architecture for that ending has already been designed. So that when I get to the ending, it gets easier because it's already mostly done. So I can't pick any one aspect of it. Certainly not. I don't love the part of a novel being finished and this part, for example. I'd much rather be writing than
talking to me.
talking about something that I have written, because now, as we're talking, I'm already 8, almost 9 chapters into a new novel. So that my over my shoulder is where I'm thinking, and I'm talking about what for me is old news. I'm already writing a new novel.
Is writing a 9-to-5 job, or is it more I'll lock myself into a room for 3 weeks and then come out with lots of pages written by hand?
I think what influences me on the answer to that question is, for the writing of my first 4 novels, I was a full-time teacher and wrestling coach. And I was trying to find the time to write a novel while I had these other jobs. After GARP was published and I became self-supporting as a writer, I've never looked back. I work 7 days a week, 7 or 8 hours a day. I seem to get slower as I go. So the process hasn't speeded up for me. But when I don't have interruptions, when I'm not traveling, I work every day. I don't take a weekend off. I actually get a lot more writing done on a weekend because there aren't a lot of emails or requests or other things coming in. Other people take the weekend off, so I don't hear from anybody. So the weekends are big writing days for me.
How do you read the work of other authors? Do you read in bed or on the sofa?
I don't ever read in bed. I go to bed to sleep. I think you do your sleep a disservice and whatever author you're reading a disservice to read in bed, but that's just my opinion. I have many friends who read in bed. Not me. You'll see a treadmill over my shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
I do a lot of reading on the treadmill.
So do you have like a thing where you put the book and then you treadmill and then you can like turn?
And I have clamps to attach pages and stuff like that. And after my third knee surgery, I can't run anymore, but I can crank a treadmill up to a pretty steep incline and I can hike uphill. And I can't read a manuscript or a book on a treadmill if I'm running, but I'm not running anymore. I'm climbing. And I find that the time goes more quickly if I'm reading. So I do a lot or on the bike, on a stationary bike, also is a good place to read.
We're almost done with a short thingy. What are the author? I mean, you mentioned Melville, you mentioned Dickens, but what are more contemporary authors that you always turn back to?
Well, close friends whose work I read. I've read everything and look forward to everything that Edmund White writes. I'm reading his newest novel, The Humble Lover, now. I was a great reader as a teenager, as a student, and as a young writer. But from the moment I started to write screenplays, from the moment I was often writing a screenplay or a teleplay in between novels, my reading really suffered because now I have two jobs. I don't believe I'm going to write any more screenplays or teleplays, but I am advising on several television adaptations of my previous novels and several feature films that are in development of previous novels. So what I've said to people is, I don't want to write any more scripts for television or for film, but I will read other writers' scripts that are in development, in adaptation from my novels. So that doesn't give me much time to read anymore. And if the 19th century novel was the novel that stood as the model of the form for me, the reason I wanted to become a writer was what the 19th century novel meant to me. Nothing, as I've gotten older, has changed my mind about that. I do more rereading of 19th century novels I love than I spend reading new work.
When you read other scripts, but also for your own work, perhaps it's the same, but perhaps your answer will be different. Would you rather have real, honest, brutal feedback or constructive, coachy, supportive feedback on your work?
I don't think there's anything constructive about brutal feedback, or I wouldn't bother with it. I have a very good editor. I've always chosen where I'm published by how good the editor is, and of equal importance to me, to my editor, Jonathan Karp at Simon & Schuster in New York. Of equal importance to me is my copy editor, Amy Edelman, who has been my copy editor since Gottes Werk und Teufels Beitrag. She knows my work over the longest period of time. We keep working together, and I listen very closely to Jonathan and very closely to Amy. And I hope I always will. I hope they will always be readers for me in my life. I have if you look at my acknowledgement pages in all my novels, there's always a list of first readers whom I've asked to read a manuscript before I submit it to my editor. And those readers mean a lot to me too. I'm lucky that my earliest readers as a young writer were strong but positive, and that's made me appreciate a good close reader, and I listen to them.
So if you've worked, what are the comments that that your copy editor and your editor give you that you kind of already can anticipate, where you think, probably that part she'll want to scrap, or is there something of that kind of relationship in your working relationship?
Naturally, absolutely, yes. Because I am an ending-driven novelist, because I know where I'm going, I can rely a lot on foreshadowing, on letting the reader know what might happen or what is likely coming. I want them to be able to anticipate what's coming, what's going to happen, but I also want to keep a few things back. There have to be some surprises. And so that balance between those things I'm hiding from a reader and the things I want the reader to anticipate, that business between the what's a secret and you want to keep a secret and what you intend to foreshadow, that's a very important balance to me. And so I expect an editor or a copy editor, or my wife, Janet, who was a publisher before she became my agent, I expect those readers to say, okay, I know you're setting this up, but you don't have to tell me 10 times. 6 times would be enough.
Okay.
I'm used to hearing that. I almost never hear from one of my close readers that I should have been better prepared for this. What I hear is, oh, come on, I didn't forget that. It was only 100 pages ago.
Okay. Many readers wanted to know, like, can you share what book you are writing on at the moment? Can you give any foreshadowing of what can be read not only by your first readers but by our general readers in the coming years?
I don't like to give much of the story of a book I am writing away.
That's fine.
But there is something ungewöhnlich, there is something unusual for me about the new one. And that is, for the first time, I'm going back to a fictional character from a previous novel, a fictional character, a made-up character. To readers who are familiar with the Cider House rules, Gottes Werk und Teufels Beitrag, either the book or the film, they will remember the orphanage in Maine and the orphanage physician and abortionist who is addicted to ether. Well, that orphanage and that doctor have a small recurring scene in this new novel. In other words, let's just say there's another orphan in this novel, and that orphan comes from that familiar orphanage and was looked after by that familiar doctor and abortionist in St. Cloud's, Maine. Dr. Larch is only in a couple of chapters, and he's got a small role, and he's younger this time than my readers will remember him because it's earlier in his life and the life of the orphanage. That's all I want to say about it.
Okay, we'll be excited to read it when it progresses. One small question from the chat: do you decide the titles on your own? The titles of books?
Always, yes.
Okay.
Sometimes I have more than one. I love it when I have more than one title. When it's when I have a choice, I feel really good about having more than one title that would work equally well. This novel, Der letzte Sessellift, was a good example. I had a couple of titles that would have worked, I think, equally well or as well. I had 3 titles or 4 titles I could have used for this novel. I also had some options with the Cider House Rules. I'm always very comfortable when I have more than one name for something. I'm very big on titles. As you know, I title my chapters. That also comes from the 19th century novel. I didn't make it up. I learned it from Dickens and from Melville. I like to title my novels. So I'm good at titles, and I always end up with 2 or 3 titles for chapters in a novel that I don't get to use.
Mm-hmm. We will now move on. You have not only inspired lots of readers. One of the readers actually opened a hotel after reading Hotel New Hampshire, but you've also inspired many fellow writers. And with this, I'd like to welcome Benedict Wells to our talk. Benedict is currently in Paris, and we quickly chatted with him earlier. There he is. Hi, Benedict. Nice to see you.
Hi, nice to see you. Thank you for welcoming.
Nice to see you, Benedict.
Nice to see you, John. It is such a fun to see you again.
So, Benedict, it's probably no exaggeration to say that you became a writer because you discovered John Irving when you were a teenager, 15-year-old. Can you take us back to your younger years and explain how you found John Irving's work and which one it was?
Yes, I think it was rather the opposite. His work found me, because as a teenager, you don't, look specifically to a writer or a novel. I just found his book in my bookshelf, The Hotel New Hampshire. I was 15 years old, and back then, when I was a child, I was reading a lot. But at that time, actually, no, I was in the midst of puberty. I didn't have many interests. I was rather an outsider. I had no certain passion next to football, which I was miserable in. So I had no vision for me or my life. And then I stumbled over this book, The Hotel New Hampshire. And thank God, back then, there was no internet and there were no many possibilities. So I got this huge book, and then one day I just started it. And then I couldn't stop. I was reading it. I was in boarding school, state boarding school. I was reading it at night in the bathroom secretly. I was reading it in the I don't know where we were eating. I was reading it in my room. And there was one day I was reading it secretly at school because it was boring. I was reading it under the table, and I was coincidentally reading a scene in which the taxidermied dog Sorrow, in German Kummer, was secretly hidden in the wardrobe. And then Iowa Bob, the grandfather, was opening it. And I mean, whoever read the novel will know exactly that scene. So, and the dog, which was very nice, and the taxidermied version was very angry and attacking. And the dog kind of attacked the grandfather, jumping out of the wardrobe. And that scene made me laugh so hard that the teacher recognized it in high school and said, "Do you read in my class?" And I got a penalty for that, and it felt like. But from that moment on, not only this book and me, but also like John Irving and me were kind of like allies. And I have never experienced something like that before. And the characters in that book, the passion he had for writing them, the richness it has, the tragic, the development, the trajectories, and whatever. This book. It's impossible that one book influenced a person more than this book influenced me back then.
Was the wish to become an author, a writer, was that instilled in you beforehand, Benedict?
I mean, I had many dreams when I was a child. I can easily, draw a line from me being 7 and 8, writing the first stories, to now be a writer. But that's a mistake, because there would also be, I wanted to become a basketball player, absurd-wise, at that time I was horrible in it, or I wanted to become an architect. So writing is the only thing I came back. And the question for me always was why. And Irving, John's books showed me like the way, but I think what really made me a writer is that I was thrown into so many situations as a child and as a teenager for which I had no words. I was always a lack of words. I didn't even manage to go deeper. If you would have asked me, who are you? Well, I had no idea. What's going on? I don't know. Everything's okay. And writing showed me, even in a wordless way somehow, that there is something deeper in the world, but also inside of me. I could feel it, but I still couldn't express it. Only now, in the last years, I get it.
And what was it that, I mean, at that point, you probably couldn't reflect. I mean, perhaps you could, but thinking of myself as a 15-year-old, you probably couldn't reflect that much or that deeply about this experience. When did you kind of like grasp the implications for you later on?
I think also in the last years, because, for example, I always wondered why so many writers, and also I, write so many horrible first drafts. It's crazy. You have these masters, they write since 50 years, and still sometimes the first draft, why do I make such mistake? Why can I not write a good first draft? I mean, probably there are some geniuses who can write a good first draft, good for them, but I can't. And I always wondered, and I realized for myself, doesn't have to be for everyone, that it's like two parts of me work together. Like the childish id, that is, and like the grown-up intellectual I. And I realized that when I start to write a novel, I leave the first 1 or 2 drafts to the childish id, the subconsciousness, and because this childish part of me is responsible for the fantasy. Without that, I couldn't write. But later on, with each book anew, I grow up. And then the more and more the grown-up takes over and sorts out, and this is, let's keep on this. Why did I write about this? This could be interesting. Now I realize why I wrote about it. That's stupid, I throw it away. But you need the child. The child has to enter first. And I think what really got me with John's novels is that there is a passion in each of them that is not only intellectual and only thinking. There's with the curiosity of a child and the passion of a child, which I love in every book, he still has that. And this is something I always could, that he dared, that he was curious, that he was, the characters are so three-dimensional because you could feel that he felt them. You could feel that they were not only in his mind, they are real. For example, Hotel New Hampshire, Franny, Frank, and John are the best friends I never had, kind of. And that's, I talk too much. Sorry.
No, stimmt. Everything you say is totally true. I think it's so important to have the fantastical dalliance that only children have. If you're going to spend your life making up stories, a part of you has to be a child. A part of you has to still be a teenager, which is a reverse of this is to, people are always asking me, as I'm sure they ask you, Benedict, do you have an audience in mind? Do you have an audience in mind? Well, if there is one, it's that kid who's so hooked on a book, he's reading it under the desk in school. Yes, it is, because I was that age. I was 15 when Great Expectations, it was daunting. It was frightening to me to realize that at age 15, I'd read something that made me want to be a writer like that. And I had no reason, I had no justification to imagine I could be a writer. I was not a good student. I was struggling in school. I was, as you put it, an outsider. And I think that all writers are outsiders. Becoming a writer, especially a fiction writer, makes us more of an outsider. But I think that only outsiders want to join the club, the fellowship of making things up for a living. Most people, as they make a living, get more serious and more grown up all the time. Well, there's a part of making something up that is childlike to begin with, or you're fantasizing about being a teenager again. Think of how many of my novels are about a childhood experience or an adolescent experience that forms who the future adult will be. That's more of a common thread than the sexual politics in my novels, than the family saga part of my novels. Think of how often there's a story that begins when someone is of a formative age, of the age you were when you read Hotel New Hampshire, the same age I was when I read Great Expectations. We are children. People who make up stories for a living have gotten away with something. We've found a way to be teenagers for the rest of our lives.
Have you? Sorry.
I fully agree, and that's why we have to accept or embrace the child or the teenager, and it will make some mistakes in the first drafts. But I agree, and there's a beautiful Wordsworth quote: "The child is the father of the man, or the child is the mother of the woman." One can say, and I think it's the same.
Coming to the different writing techniques, John shared earlier that he starts with wanting to know what the end, where the book kind of will, where the protagonists will go to, what the ending is. Benedict, is that one thing that you kind of copied, that you got inspired to do as well?
Yes, I think we have the same idea, but different ways to go there, because I also need to know where the book is leading to. This idea is a hypothesis. I can replace it in the process over the years, but I need to know where I had to. For example, if I start a journey from New York, I need to know if I go to Toronto or if I go to LA. But then on the way, you still can decide a different route. But my technique, since I'm a procrastinator, and I have to include my lazy parts in my process, I use the ending like as a carrot while I'm on the bike, and I can't wait to get there. Finally, I'm allowed, in probably 3 months, I'm allowed to finally write the ending down. I have it in my mind, And then finally, after the end of the first draft, I get there and I write it down. It's like you stand on the top of a mountain and you have for the first time clear sight on what you're actually doing. You still don't know maybe why you are doing it, but you know what you are doing. And then comes my favorite part of the whole writing process, the second draft with this knowledge. But his method is kind of, I think we have the same idea.
I agree. Yeah. Stimmt.
is there, coming to the writing technique, is there any, do you ever have like this moment of like writer's block where you're like, oh, shoot, I don't know what to write at all? John?
No.
No, Benedict.
I never have felt a block. Like Benedict says, I've gone back and looked at something I've written and thought, oh God, this has to change. This has to, chapter 5 should be chapter 1, chapter 2 should be chapter 5. Especially in the beginning of a novel, especially in the early going, I make lots of changes. But because I know the ending, it's a lot easier to change beginnings than it is endings. Because there's no damage done when you change a beginning. If there's 400 pages behind you and you change your mind about the ending, now you have a lot of work in front of you. So I don't know what writer's block is, except possibly a moment of doubting one's career choice. That doesn't happen to me, or hasn't happened to me. I honestly can't imagine it. There are always novels waiting to be written, and I just try to be, wie sagt man auf Deutsch? A horse with blinders on, ein Pferd mit Scheuklappen.
Yeah, I agree. I never had a writer's block. I had one moment when I was first published, and I forgot a bit how horrible it is to write a first draft. That feeling I confused with a writer's block, but it's not. It was just, no, it's good old daily first draft, okay? And since I accept trial and error, I think that's the one thing that maybe could give you the feeling of having a writer's block, not accepting that you have to do mistakes. I was recently reading Manifesto by Bernardine Evaristo, and she absolutely rewrote every single book she has ever written. She totally embraces the trial and error, and I think if you do that, then you can't have a writer's block. Then you only have ideas that work out and some ideas that don't work out.
Yeah, rewriting is really, it's sehr wichtig. The rewriting is very, very important, and I look forward to that part. I think I like rewriting more than I do first drafts, because like you, I'm sort of impatient to get to the ending, which I always know more about than I know about the beginning, and then I know when I get to the ending, if there are revisions of a big kind, they'll be in the beginning of the book.
Yeah.
They'll be in that getting started part of the book.
What is the point where you have the feeling, okay, this book that has, in both of your cases, I mean, the books and your writing accompanies you for a number of years. I mean, this is not an aspect of like a couple of months. So when is the point or which feeling do you have when you think, we're nearing the end? This book is finished or almost finished. Benedict.
I don't know. It's a feeling that it's hard to be, or it's hard to describe it. Because when I was younger, I was more impatient. And I missed, because the things like the finishing line for the readers is when you publish a book, but that doesn't have to be like the finishing line for yourself. This can be earlier or later. And the more I wrote, or the more I'm into writing, or the longer, I realized that I love time. Because time gives me a better feeling, and sometimes I think I'm finished, and then half a year later I realize, no, now I get ideas, because ideas are unpredictable. So I try to keep the process as long as possible, to be in every single corner before I close the building. And I think there's a moment when the story isn't accepting anything, and the characters aren't accepting anything new, and you can't make it longer, but you also can't make it shorter. And I think somewhere in between, you find your ending, but then there's a 10% chance that you were not exactly there. But this is what you have to accept. But I never, I mean, there's so many other books, like, for example, On the Road, or Dickens was writing incredibly fast when we talk about him. And so it's like something different for every writer.
I agree. I mean, I don't worry about when a novel is done. I'm not in a hurry. In fact, when I feel an urgency to get there, that's the first draft part. The rewriting, I like to be able to, when I've finished the first draft, I like to be able to step away for a while. That's when I send a first draft out to some of my early first readers, so that I can get away from the novel before I go back to it again, because I know when I go back to it again, I'll see more. But I'm in no hurry to rush the finished part. The first part, yes. The first draft, yes. I want that to be as consecutive as I can make it. But I enjoy rewriting. I think some writers don't, or certainly there are writers I read or I don't read because I don't think they've rewritten enough. I can tell that.
There's I think also a common misconception that books come out in one. There's kind of like giving birth once and not kind of like reworking multiple times. How big of an aspect is the work part, and how much of an aspect, like in general, is the talent for words part in a great novel?
John, after you.
Well, I think you get better by doing anything, doing something and doing it again and doing it again makes you better. I credit my experience with repetition as a wrestler, the minutiae of how many times you drill or practice a new move until it feels like second nature, until it feels natural. The poet Marvin Bell once said, it's not so natural to be natural. There's another way of saying that is it's not spontaneous to look spontaneous. It takes a lot of work to make something look like or sound like you just thought it up. But that's the way you want it to sound. You want it to sound as if it always existed, and if it's as easy as conversation. That invites the reader in. But I don't get to that level of fluidity, of fluency the first time. There are too many halts and interruptions and too many breaks, too many sentences that are too long, whatever. Fine tune. I love the fine tuning part. And so with each draft or each revision, I consciously go slower, langsamer. To get to the end of the first draft, okay, I'm in a bit of a hurry. Then I slow down.
I agree. For example, it's the one thing I appreciate over the years is that the more I have written, the clearer the more I could see my style, and the easier I know the way to express what I want to the essence. For example, when I started this conversation, I was so nervous and I tried to say 5 different things in like 2 minutes and was kind of a mess. And if you would rewrite this part, we would try to make everything a bit clearer and more focused and get rid of some parts and make it understandable, and less is more and so on. And that takes time. And for example, in my first books, I had no idea what could be my style or what could be this. And then you find it a bit, and then you have at least a good tool in your toolbox. I still also, I think you once said that most of your writing is rewriting. And I also would be team, the real talent is the stamina. Because I think so many people are talented and have fun to play with words and have a certain feeling for that. But I think the rewriting, if you love it, if you have fun to make it better, to see a story grow, see the characters develop, this is actually for me the real part of writing. And that takes time, and that takes work, and that takes hours and hours and hours you spend with that process. But I think that's the rewarding part on this. When you feel, no book I ever write will be perfect. There will be flaws and mistakes, but to see that you find the words at the end you at least wanted to express a bit, that is such a precious feeling. And that has to do with rewriting, with stamina, with endurance, with hours and hours you spend, and coming to the essence of what you want to tell, of the emotions, of the feelings, of the thoughts. This is the most precious part, and that is rewriting.
Yeah. Well, any good athlete would tell you that the reason what they do looks so fluid when it's done right is because of how many times they've done it. It's because of how long they've paid attention to the same small thing until it looks consecutive and it looks like, oh, that was natural. That's just something you do every day. No.
There's a Chinese anecdote about this.
It's a lot of it takes a lot of practice to look smooth, to look spontaneous.
There is a Chinese anecdote. I want to share it. Maybe it's stupid, but the Chinese an anecdote. The Chinese emperor is coming to a region in the mountains because there's an old master, an old painter. And when he finally arrives there, the emperor asks the painter, "Can you paint me or draw me a horse?" And the old master draws a horse, just a few draws. That's it. And the emperor is kind of, yeah, it looks good, but it was a bit simple, only a few draws. And then the master realizes the disappointment in the view of the other and says, "Come into my house." Then he opens a drawer, and there are thousands of paintings, all the horse. And in the beginning, he needed many, many draws to paint it. And it took him years of work to make it very simple. And we can't show our drawers, but I think it's for all the writers the same. You try to write a horse again and again and again with each book. And finally, in the best moments, you manage to do it with a few.
Yeah.
Is there something that you can't learn in writing? That you either have or you don't?
Think of the friends you have and the ones who are funny. And then think of the friends you have who couldn't be funny if they tried. Who
Yes.
couldn't tell a good joke and make it work. We all have friends who are naturally funny, even when they're not trying to be funny. Well, in my case, I think being funny is the only natural instinct I have. I'm not trying to be funny. I can't stop myself from clowning around. I don't think that's the one thing about writing, I would say, is that you can't be funny if you aren't funny. You can learn how to do a lot of things, but in my experience, knowing my writer friends and myself, you either are funny or you aren't. And think of the writers who get in trouble publicly, make enemies.
In trouble for what?
What I'm going to say is that, generally speaking, it's the writers who are comic. They're the ones who draw the criticism and the fire, because you can't help but be funny about everything, even things that a lot of people don't think is funny. That's how Salman Rushdie got in trouble. He told a joke. It was a good joke if you weren't in that circle of people who said, well, you can't make a joke about that. There are people who believe there are things that are sacred from humor, or should be. Well, a comic novelist, in my view, is a kind of compulsive shit disturber. That's what you think of. That's what you do. Mm-hmm. That's often your first reaction. Kurt Vonnegut had many fans. He also had many detractors, many critics who loathed him because he made fun of things they took oh so seriously. Well, so that's an element of fiction that isn't, I think, much under discussion. You either I don't think writing is necessarily genetic. I don't know. I have no idea. Genetics confounded me as a student. I couldn't tell you, but I do think that being funny is something you're likely born with, or you aren't.
I'd like to come to your protagonists, which accompany you, of course, for many, many years. And as we've heard, perhaps there will be protagonists that will reappear in John Irving's work and then on our books that we have on our bedside table. When you finish a book, like or your novels, how do your protagonists stay with you, or do they not?
I mean, that depends. There are some, for example, The End of Loneliness. I had written 7 years on it, and it was kind of heavy because of these topics. And for example, that would be my answer. I can't avoid my topics. I tried to not write about loneliness. I write short stories that were absurd and everything. And in the end, it was again about loneliness. And that was the moment when I gave up. Okay, these are my topics for the rest of my life. I have accepted it. But End of Loneliness was kind of like especially heavy because I had to carry the topics loss and death and everything for 7 years. So there was a moment, the book ends on a field with the characters, like almost on a painting. And there was a moment when I said, okay, thank you, everyone. See you never again. Goodbye. Because I really, I couldn't imagine to keep or to write more with them and whatever. But other characters, they stay in my mind. For example, from my first novels, it's only Rauli Kantas, the Lithuanian young musician. I can't get rid of him. He lives inside of me. And especially the characters of my latest novel, Heartland, I can't let them go. I love them too much. I never had something like that. Even though I ended the book, I can't let them go. And so I think it's sometimes it's like a work relationship full of feelings, but you say goodbye. And sometimes it's more, and sometimes it's too close, like with The End of Loneliness, that you have to let them go. And I think it's a total mixture. And I would love to hear how it is for John.
John,
very much the same. I agree with you that you can't predict which ones you're going to let go and which ones haunt you. I can think of how many of my characters have reappeared under different names. How often is there an angry loner of a woman who is possessed with a kind of self-confidence that distinguishes her, that makes her stand out, that makes her heroic, but also is a danger to herself. Now, that female character, I sometimes find myself halfway, 3/4 into a novel. And Nora, for example, in Der letzte Sessellift, and I find myself saying, oh, 3/4 of the way in, it's Melanie again. It's Hester again. Because they're not all the same character, but Melanie in Gottes Werk und Teufels Beitrag, Hester in Owen Meany, and Nora in Der letzte Sessellift. Of course, they're the same character. Okay, some different features. I obviously can't let them go. I think I've said goodbye. But suddenly, 3/4 of the way into the first draft, I think, oh, it's you again. You're back. I can't get rid of you. Here you are again. So it's not everything is in the author's so controlling control. Not everything.
It's like an endless theater play where they come again on stage in disguise, and you sit in the audience like, oh my God, I know that person, and I never thought of this. I had the feeling, for example, I once wrote a character called Marty, and then I wrote a character called Cameron, and they're like cousins, kind of, not exactly the same, but yeah, they're like, I can see this, and I never thought about that. It's actually the same one in disguise with a mask on, but I will think about it.
Yeah, that's. Then they surprised me. I'm halfway, 3/4 into a novel sometime before, and I'm thinking of, oh, what an original character you are. And then, no, not so original.
I feel this.
We have 2 small questions that have been reappearing. And one is there is many photos on the wall behind you, John. Which is your favorite picture that you have hung on the wall, if you can choose one, or one that is important to you?
I can't begin. I can't begin. I know when I see people on Zooms, or I see people working at home nowadays on television, and they always have books behind them, I suspect largely unread. I think often props. I surround myself with these pictures are only distinguished for me. They're pictures of my family. They're pictures of my children at different ages. They're pictures of my closest friends or members of my family. They're not special probably to anyone but me.
Benedict, there's one picture that I saw and that touched me while preparing for this interview and now coming to an end. And it is the picture where you first met John Irving as a fan in 2010, 13 years ago. You traveled to Zurich and you made the way to a reading, and you gave John Irving your book, Hotel New Hampshire, to sign it. What did you write into it? Do you remember?
The thing that the book was already damaged because there was a moment when I don't know why like a bottle of ink was over it, and John wrote just like a very nice lines in it. I wish I would have it. I'm not at home. I wish I could show it. And yeah, that was like obviously like a unbelievable moment. Imagine if you have like, for example, John, imagine you would meet Melville or Dickens. That's crazy. That's not possible to imagine. And also, so many circles had to be closed to reach moments like this. You know, imagine you're 15 years old, life is unpredictable, world is big but blurry, and you think, oh my God, I try to become a writer, and then you get rejected. The way to be published also at Diogenes, at the same publishing house and whatever, that's miracle thoughts. That's usually it's dreams, nothing else. And so these moments, you can have them, you can experience them, but it takes you years to digest, to realize what happened. Even more when I saw, for example, I was in that room with the pictures. I was in that room in Toronto with the photos, and I know that there's an Academy Award somewhere in that room too, and I didn't dare to touch it for Cider House Rules, the screenplay. And imagine these moments. That these are when you keep like your 5 most precious things under the bed. These moments are one of them.
And I think that for many of the readers who have been listening to you talk sharing your insights into your work and the life and the books, that perhaps this evening has been one of an inspiring moment for them as well. Benedict, John, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me and answering all the questions of our readers.
Vielen Dank. It's great to see your face again and hear your voice, Benedict.
Same, John. I was looking forward to this for months. It's great to see you. Say please hello to Janet, and it was really it's great. It's great. I'm blessed, and thanks to everyone for listening, and thank you, Fiona. But it was great to see you, John. Really a pleasure.
Thank you, Fiona.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone for watching, for staying tuned for so long. And when we prepared for this session, I remembered writing to Benedict and John. Fiona will moderate the conversation that should have a bit of a Zoom family call with friends and family scattered around the world. And I think that's exactly what happened. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful evening and day in Toronto. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, John. Thanks, Benedict. And we're looking forward that there is so much more to read from both of you.